Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Strength and Weakness podcast with Guy and Davion. So for the last several weeks, Davion, you and I have been discussing what it's like in regards to relationship. If you want to be in a romantic relationship with somebody, if you want to be dating, if you eventually want to get married, what does that look like for somebody who's a follower of Jesus but is attracted to the same gender? There are some unique nuances that go with that, especially when it comes to relationship. And so we've been discussing things like, how would you reveal that information, and what does marriage look like? And so those have been good conversations that hopefully have been helpful for people who listen to our podcast who are in that situation. Today, to kind of finish off this series, what I thought we could discuss is two things. Number one, what do you do if you've actually been married for a period of years, maybe even decades, and you are struggling with attractions to the same gender, but for whatever reason, you've never brought that into the light with your spouse. You've never revealed that information to your spouse. And here you are now years or decades into a marriage and you're wondering, wow, should I tell my spouse? How on earth would I do that? So I thought we could discuss that. And then another avenue that I thought would be important for us to consider for a few minutes is, do you need to tell your kids? Is it their business? What benefit would there be in telling your kids? And if you're going to, what strategies would we have that we could offer some strategies you could employ to be able to help you be successful if you do decide to include your kids with this information. So that's what we'll discuss today on our podcast. All along, Davion, we've been discussing this idea, of course, that you need to bring this into the light before you get married. And we've kind of shared our own experience in that.
Mm-hmm.
But what on earth do you do, Davion, if you've been married for a while and you've never talked to your spouse about this? I've seen that happen actually several times. This is actually more common than you would expect. Davion, can you think of some reasons as to why you would not want to tell your spouse about this, or maybe why somebody wouldn't have brought this into the light before marriage? Like what kind of possible reasons would somebody have to not want their spouse to be included with this information?
Yeah. Oh man. Well, yeah, first of all, I know it's very challenging because personally, from personal experience, there's so much, shame and guilt for me that I felt surrounding my struggle with being attracted to the same sex. And so I can imagine someone feeling similar to how I did and pondering, okay, is this person still going to want to be with me? Are they still going to think the same of me? Are they going to think less of me? And so I can imagine it can feel very tempting to just want to keep it under wraps. But I think aside from that, I could also see someone maybe feeling a sense of not wanting to let it define who they are. And so you can almost say like there's some nobility there, like, okay, I don't want this to impact or affect my marriage, so I'm not going to talk about it. I could see it from that angle, but I think those would probably be the only two reasons, is fear or shame and maybe guilt. And some people may not just know how, or just like they just or just like, I don't know how to bring this up. I don't know when to bring this up. Should I bring this up? So I think it could be any number of those things.
Well, your points are well taken, because you're right. I remember when I told my first wife, Kathy, many years ago, we were married for 28 years, but when I told her, it was one of the most terrifying moments of my life, because she had the right of refusal. Maybe she was going to be like, I don't want to be married to somebody who's dealing with that.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, that wasn't her response, nor was your wife with you. So I understand people's hesitation. And I think the other thing is, a lot of times, especially if you are in the church, a lot of times people in the church can make promises that I think are very short-sighted and simplistic. And one of the promises that is often made, I think, or has been historically often made towards people who are dealing with this, is, don't worry, if you get married to somebody of the opposite sex, this is something that will eventually leave you. Like once you're with your spouse and you're with somebody of the opposite sex, you're gonna this desire and this capability of yours is gonna be gone. And that's simplistic and not helpful, because very rarely have I ever met anybody who was homosexually attracted, got married to the opposite sex, and that just completely left them. That's silly. And so a lot of times churches people who are good-hearted, they're trying to help, but they make these promises that they can't keep. And it's a simplistic antidote to a really complex reality, and it's not helpful. So that's another reason why I think a lot of times people may want to include their spouse in this, because they're like, well, I get married, it's going to go away anyway.
Right.
Of course, we know that's not the case. So you're right, Davion. In my ministry, Strength and Weakness, over the years now, I've been doing it for 18 years. And I've come across many people who are homosexually attracted who have never told their spouse. It's unfortunate. I think with the gift of 2020 hindsight, I think they all look back and go, man, I wish I had. But now that I've been married for 10 or 20 years, I don't know what to do here. And it's tricky. You said it's convoluted and tricky. It sure is, because to now, after years of marriage, to talk about this would, to the spouse, really feel like maybe they've been betrayed, maybe they've been lied to all these years. And, how is it possible that we could be this intimate, this close? I thought I knew everything about you. And now, after all these years, now you're telling me this? Like, it would, an obvious next question would be, what else is going on in your life that you've not told me after all these years? So it is tricky. But I think, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, while it would be difficult, while it would cause some hurt to the spouse, I do think it's a good thing to eventually bring this into the light, because marriage is about authenticity, it's about honesty, it's
Right.
about intimacy, emotional intimacy, relational intimacy, physical intimacy, and how can you accomplish all of that by hiding something that is such an integral part of who you are? So I think the answer is yes. We've got to find a way to help you be successful in revealing this information to your spouse. It will be tricky. It could cause some hurt and some mistrust at the beginning. But maybe in this podcast we can discuss some strategies on overcoming those things. But I do think, first of all, let's say this: maybe you've been married for decades and you've never talked about it. I think you need to. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's hard for me to imagine in my marriage keeping something that's so big from my spouse.
So integral. Yeah.
Yeah, and not that it has to be something that, defines me or whatever, but I think there, like you said, so much of marriage is authenticity, and I want to know what my wife is dealing with so that I can support her and love her and help her, and she wants to know the same things, that I'm dealing with, so that she can be in my corner. And I think,
Yep.
yeah, I 100% agree that at some point you kind of just have to just disclose what's going on. And I even think there's a sense of freedom and intimacy that can be cultivated, provided things go well. But, and just being known. There's just something about being fully known that helps us to feel like we're fully loved. And I think when my wife knows me and I feel known by her, I also feel loved and seen. And there's something about her knowing the darkest parts of my life and still sticking by me that makes me go, man, this is awesome. I think this is what marriage should be like. It's a unconditional, I'm gonna love you no matter what. And so I think to hide it or to keep it under wraps prevents your marriage from having the intimacy that it could have.
Wow,
So
that's such a great point. To be fully known and be fully loved is really a beautiful thing. And I think you're right. It imitates actually exactly what Jesus intended for marriage, because, of course, according to Ephesians chapter 5, Christian marriage is to emulate Jesus in the church. And the whole thing about Jesus in the church is that Jesus fully knows us, our brokenness, weakness, and struggles and all, and still fully loves us. And so in that regard, then, when you do that in marriage, it certainly does imitate the very heart of Christ and his relationship with us, the church. So that's a great point, actually. Thanks for saying that. The first step, I think, is number one. I just said it. include some trusted spiritual advisors who can guide you and help you through this. That's number one. Don't do it alone. Number two, I don't think you've got to do it right away. Like, let's say you've come to the conclusion, okay, I do need to talk to my spouse about this. We don't got to do it tomorrow. I think strategize, plan, pray, spend time praying, asking for the Lord to give you words of compassion, wisdom, honesty, truth. Pray for Satan to be bound while you, and for your marriage and your relationship to be protected while you go through this. Those are the first two things I think would be important. And I think the other thing, Davion, is I think you've got to be able to share this from a place of strength. In other words, your message to your spouse should be, honey, I'm sorry I've not brought this into the light before. I was ashamed. I was embarrassed. I felt trapped. I wasn't sure how to do this. But now that I am, I just want you to know that my attractions do not control me. I control them.
Mm-hmm.
And I am devoted to you. I'm devoted to you as my spouse. I'm devoted to our family. I'm devoted to purity and righteousness, and I'm devoted to the Lord and his church. So you're coming at it from a place of strength, not a place of weakness.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely presents differently if, and hopefully that's the case, is that it is, you are coming from a place of, hey, this has been in my life, but this has not been an area that, I haven't been acting out or I haven't been doing X, Y, and Z. And I think that would certainly help your spouse to feel confident. Okay, he's in a good place. He's doing what he needs to do. And I can see that as well. Your point about not mentioning it if the relationship is rocky. I think there's points where sometimes relationships are rocky because it feels like one spouse is probably hiding something or not being fully honest. And so I think in that situation, I feel like it would be beneficial depending. I mean, obviously getting lots of input from people you trust. And I think, making these kinds of decisions alone with no wisdom or counsel, it, to me, would be terrifying. And I would probably be impulsive and do something I regret. But so I echo that. But I think that would be the only case there is, sometimes a lack of being known. And, like there's marriages where it's like, I just feel like there's something off or he's not being honest and it's creating a rift. I think that might be a situation where maybe you should. But a question I did have is in that conversation. So say you have someone who is same-sex attracted, hasn't told their spouse, and is thinking about telling them, do you think they should do that just them and their spouse, or do you think they should have someone in there with them that maybe they both trust? What would you say would be the best way to navigate having that conversation?
That's a good question. I think it would be ideal to have, if you both have a couple that you feel safe with, that you can be honest with, and who respects your need for privacy and confidentiality, and they can be there to support both of you while you go through this. I think that's ideal. It's not a must, but I think it would certainly help. But you bring up a good point, because I think a lot of times I've heard of husbands especially doing something like this. Honey, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody this, that, that's not fair.
Right.
You can't unload this kind of information on your poor spouse and then demand you can't tell anybody. No, she's now got this information. She will need to unpack this, unravel this with a trusted spiritual advisor, somebody that she can feel like she can be honest with. I do think it's reasonable to say, honey, please don't tell the whole world. This is our personal family, but with this friend and that friend, I understand you're going to want to talk about this, and you have my permission to do so. Like, I think that's reasonable.
Right.
And I think the other thing, Davion, is you shouldn't handcuff your spouse by saying, well, now that we've had the conversation, that's it. We can never talk about this again. Listen, over a period of days, weeks, maybe even months, your spouse is going to have questions. They're going to be like, wait a minute, I remember like 10 years ago, or, I always felt distant from you for this reason, or like some stuff's going to come out while the Holy Spirit works in their hearts and while they ruminate over this reality. It would be wrong for you now to start getting defensive and, why do you keep bringing this up? Why do you keep talking about this? This isn't fair. We talked about this 3 months ago. I thought we were done. Don't do that to your spouse. You brought this into light. You're the one who kept it hidden for so many years. Good Lord.
Right.
give your spouse the opportunity now to ask questions. Don't be defensive when they do, and answer honestly when they do. I think that would be another key to help you be successful in the days, weeks, months, and years to come.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. It's definitely important to expect that this isn't gonna just be a one and done conversation.
Right.
And that,
Yeah. No
especially if
kidding.
you've been married for so long, they're gonna have questions about random situations or things they may have observed, or maybe start connecting dots or asking for clarity. And
Yeah.
so I think that's a great addendum, just making sure people know what to expect. And that it's okay for your spouse to ask questions, that it's okay for them to be curious or to inquire about, more about the struggle that you have. So
Yeah.
yeah, good point.
So, Davion, what do you think about our kids? Like you've got, how many kids have you
Yeah.
got, Davion?
I have three.
You have a lot over there. Holy smokes. Okay, and I've got four.
You have more than me,
So,
so
and all my kids are in their 20s and early 30s. So I'm in a completely different stage of life.
yeah.
Your kids are all very young, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
One's 4, one is 2, about to turn 3 next month, and then I have a daughter who is 7 months. So
So,
sorry, he's
uh,
5. My oldest is 5. He just turned
your
5.
oldest is
So
5.
yeah.
So, Davion, I don't know. How do you feel about this? Like, we've gotten this question a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Should I tell my kids? Is it their business? Should they be included in this information? I don't know. I do have some thoughts on it, but I'd love to hear what you think. And do you plan
Yeah.
on telling your kids someday about what you've experienced?
Yeah. So I think it's tricky because, well, one, it's nerve-wracking, because there's this fear I have of, my kids, not necessarily with them, but with their friends knowing, and me being like, oh, my kids' friends being like, oh, you have the dad who's gay, or like you have the dad who's this, or the dad, like, and them just wildly making these assumptions, or, you know, is it going to affect their friendships? Is it going to affect the relationships they have? And, obviously I don't identify as gay. I'm not, but it's kind of like with kids, they're just like, oh, he is attracted to men, he's gay. And it's like, well, it's more complex than that. And kids can't really understand that entirely. But I do think that in my situation, because I am a minister and because my life is so public and I share about it from the pulpit, they're going to find out eventually. And I think it's not really a matter of, do I want to tell them? It's just more so like, how are they going to hear about it first? Is it going to be they hear about it in a sermon one day when I'm preaching, or they hear about it by watching one of these podcasts, or, so I think they're going to know. I feel like I want them to know, I want them to see like, hey, I struggle and I fight to be faithful and I fight to live a righteous life. And I want them to see that, hey, dad struggles with this, but he loves mom so much, it doesn't affect their marriage, and he's still a great dad, and it doesn't impact our dynamic with him. I think for someone outside of, my position or my role, like say you have someone who has been married for decades and hasn't told their spouse or their kids, or maybe, their spouse knows, but the kids don't. I don't know. I feel like that's more your wheelhouse. I would say, it's a case by case. I don't think it's a matter of,
Yeah.
right and wrong, but a matter of
Yeah.
what's best. And I think in some scenarios, it might be best for you to tell your kids, because maybe it would be helpful for them to see you be so vulnerable and see you struggle
Yeah.
and fight. And in other scenarios, maybe your kids don't need to know because it doesn't really impact anything or change anything. So,
Yeah. So I remember when I told my kids, Davion, my kids were relatively young. I think like 12 and 13 years old at the time. I only had 2 kids. Later, my family we had adopted 2 more, but at the time I only had 2 kids. So I think they were 12 and 13. And the only reason why I decided to reveal this to them was for the very same reason you just mentioned. I was a pastor, right? I was a minister of a church, but I was starting this ministry, Strength and Weakness. I had no idea what the ministry would eventually become in terms of its scope and how many people we help. But I knew that, I'm going to start this ministry. I don't want them to hear it from someone else or,
Mhm.
So I thought, I need to include them. I also decided for that very reason to include the rest of my family, brother, sisters and in-laws, and it turned into a big thing for me for this very reason. But you brought up some good positives, I think, as to why you might want to include your children in this. I think, number one, it needs to be in an age-appropriate way that you tell your kids. And I don't know if you should tell your kids when they're really young, like maybe wait until they're at a season in life when they're even understanding what you're talking about. Maybe that's, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. If you are going to do this, wait until they're a little bit older and they can even grasp what it is you're talking about. There's, I think, a benefit to our children seeing mom and dad as people who are not perfect, but faithful. People who love God, have deep convictions about the Bible, who love their church, strive and fight every day to be righteous and godly, yet are people who struggle. We're just regular human beings. And we don't want our kids to think that we're perfect. We want our kids to be able to imitate how we fight and struggle and how we repent, when we do have a tough time, how we can recover from that. I think these all set up a good example for our children. And I think it's not helpful for our kids to have this image of us as if we're all perfect and we don't have any struggles in life. That's not helpful at all.
Right.
So there are some benefits there. However, I do think this, you also brought up this good point. I think it's a case-by-case situation. You and I decided to do this because we lead public ministry. But there will be others who will be like, I don't know, like, I don't lead a public ministry. Other than my wife and a couple of friends, nobody knows. And I just don't think it's anybody else's business. I get that. I don't think just because you're same-sex attracted, you got to tell your kids when they're teenagers. Like, what kid even wants to know that information?
Right.
Like, what kid wants their parent telling them about their personal, private likes and dislikes sexually? Like, most kids would be like, I don't even want to hear that information. Like, that is TMI, man. I don't want it. So I could see a parent going, yeah, my wife knows. I got a couple of friends who know, but I'm not going to include my children in on this. It's not their business, and I don't want them to know. I think that's also a right answer.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think, the people that need to know should know. And that doesn't always include your kids. I think spouse, absolutely. I feel like that's a need to know. And perhaps a handful of people that you trust that are invested in you, that are helping you and guiding you. But I think kids kind of fall into that maybe category of maybe it's beneficial. Maybe you have a kid who struggles with being attracted to the same sex and you feel like, hey, maybe sharing my story would help them and they can see from my example, or maybe you have a kid who has lots of friends who wrestle with that and they're looking for, like those scenarios where, hey, I think that might be good for me to tell my kids, and other scenarios where it's like, don't really see a need to. And I think either one is okay. I don't think one is better than the other. I think it just depends on you, how you feel about it, where your kids are at, where your family's at, and you making the best call based on what you got. So,
like, I think maybe it's not a yes or no. Maybe it's more like, at this season, I see no need. But maybe the day will come where you'd be like, you know what? I think it would be good for my kid to understand this part about me because they need to know that their dad is a struggler and an overcomer. And I want them to be able to be an overcomer in life also. So I can see why it would be beneficial at this season of their life to understand this. Or maybe you're right. Like you said, maybe they've got some LGBTQ friends at school and they've got a lot of questions, and you could be like, okay, let me share something with you, but to help you know that I understand what you're talking about here. So it could be like, hey, I'm not ready to do this. My kids are 15 and 16. I don't want to tell them. It's not their business right now, but maybe the day will come when you could change your mind. So it's a case-by-case situation. But I would like to go back to what I said about the situation that if you're going to share this with your spouse later in marriage, I think the same thing applies. Your message to your children, Christian dad or Christian mother, needs to be this. This does not control me. I control it. You don't need to worry about dad being involved in a gay relationship. You don't need to worry about me, being controlled by this. That is not the case. Let me share this with you from a place of strength. I'm in control. I follow Jesus. I follow the Lord. I am devoted to my family, my wife, and my children. And you don't need to worry about dad struggling with this. It's got to be from a place of strength.
Right.
And when it is, then, your kids can understand that throughout life's difficulties, you can be an overcomer. And you don't
Hmm.
have to allow these things, these areas of struggle, brokenness, and weakness in your life to be a determining factor that ruin your Christian life, but actually shine as an example of what it means to be a blessing to others and not allow life to get you down, but to, again, overcome. So share from a place of strength. Got any
Right.
final thoughts on that before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I think I'd just say, it's important to distinguish that struggling does not equate to you're doing terrible, right?
Yes.
And your kids, if you're telling them, you may tell them you struggle with this, and I think what you said is great. Like, I control it. It doesn't have control over me, and that if it is the opposite, then, maybe get to a place of strength first to where you can confidently say, hey, I'm in a great place. But I think feeling tempted is very normal, and so I think even clarifying like what does it mean to be in a place of strength, right? Like this is, I do feel tempted. I do feel moments where I have weaknesses, but I strive to overcome them. I'm open with the people I need to be open with. My wife knows everything. So just really bolstering their confidence and you know what you're sharing with them, that that they can feel confident that okay,
Yeah, that's great. And being a great example to them.
yeah,
So as they live their Christian life and go through their struggles, their areas of brokenness, their temptations, their challenges, they can look back and go, wow, look at how my dad deals with his stuff.
hmm,
And look at how he does it successfully. So I think you're setting your kids up as a great example of what it means to be an overcomer in Christ. And man, that's a good thing all day long.
absolutely,
Awesome. Well, thanks, Davion. This was a good conversation. I'm glad we did this today. I trust
yeah,
it's going to be a big help to whoever listens. Or if you're even trying to help, maybe this doesn't fit your life, but you're trying to help somebody who's going through these things, then I trust today's information has been really helpful. Thanks for joining us, everybody. The Strength and Weakness Podcast with Guy and Davion.